Hello and welcome to another Facebook Live from the Daily Mirror. Lovely to have you joining us. And along with me is our online political editor, Dan Bloom. Hi, Dan.
Hello. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Lovely to see you. Thanks for taking part today on what's obviously a busy day, and we'll move on to that in terms of a big announcement by the Bank of England, which will then have a factor in what we're actually sort of subject of today, which is next Wednesday's spring statement. It feels like spring, doesn't it, with some of the sunshine out there, so aptly named. But for those who don't know what a spring statement is, can you tell us what it is and perhaps what it isn't?
Yeah, so it's the kind of mini budget, if you like. It's the interim update on all the economy and everything for the 6-month period between the budget. Now, in the past, it's been a bit confused because there used to be kind of the autumn statement as it was, and then that sort of thing would be quite a big event in itself. And then COVID came along and you forgot the whole budget spring statement distinction because we just had financial announcements all the time from Rishi Sunak, doing everything from furlough to business loans and all the rest of it. What they're trying to do now is get back to a traditional model where the budget in the autumn now is kind of a big fiscal event, as they call it, where they're announcing things like tax on cigarettes and booze and the minimum wage rise and big changes. And then the spring statement is more of an update on the finances. The problem with that this time is that the update on the finances is going to be extremely grim. We've been told that essentially Whitehall officials are pretty braced for inflation to go above 8%, could even hit as high as 10% in those forecasts. But if the Chancellor doesn't then immediately announce something to go along with that and to help people deal with that, it's going to be big trouble. And, there's all sorts of other things that are coming out. We're going to have inflation figures monthly on the morning of the statement. And I think we've just had the Bank of England now, haven't we, give some pretty bad news for people on flexible mortgages and stuff, haven't they?
That's right. And I should have said, actually, right at the beginning, if you've got any questions, then message them in. I'll put them to Dan. He can answer them. I'm sure he can. If it's other subjects, maybe business related, I can answer it. Anyway, we'll try and answer it as best we can. So keep them coming in. So what do you think? And you mentioned the Bank of England making its announcement. You mentioned also that the forecast of inflation maybe hitting 8 to 10%. That's certainly what the Bank of England has talked about today. Quite dramatically increased its forecast. So what do you think are going to be the big themes coming from next Wednesday? What do you think and are we going to get any big announcements?
Well, this is my favourite thing. I think we all laughed in a planning meeting once upon a time when someone said, do you know what the rabbit out the hat's going to be?
Rabbit out the hat, yes. Yeah.
If we knew, we'd be running stories about it now, but we will try our best. So the short answer is that we don't know if there's going to be big announcements. What we do know is that the Chancellor's trying not to make big announcements, and anything he does make, he will have been kind of pushed into doing against his will. Because the problem is that you say which stories will be the biggest. The story that is the only thing really is the cost of living crisis. But that in itself is made up of a huge number of different things. So you've got energy bills going up by £693 a year this time, and then kind of could be another £1,000 in October. You've got benefits and pensions and wages all going up by less than inflation. You've got things like fuel duty. It's frozen at the moment, but there are some Tories pushing to cut it. And then, of course, you've got the national insurance rise, which is going up in April, going to cost, pretty much anyone who works unless they're on a really, really low wage, essentially. And for Rishi Sunak to kind of make that all better, he would have to act on every single one of those things. And he doesn't want to do that because it would cost billions and billions of pounds after a pandemic where he spent billions and billions, but people kind of didn't really come out of it feeling better off on the other side. So it's a pretty grim situation for everyone. And there are certain things like benefits, for example. They've always resisted just making the basic rate of benefits higher because it's permanent spending. It's a black mark on their balance sheets as much as it's just a bit of relief for people on benefits who think that the levels are just not high enough.
And
then the same duty with all sorts of other things that are coming up. So he's kind of got to announce something, but inevitably, if he does announce something like this £200 repayable loan for energy bills, where there's some speculation, I think it's just speculation, that he could make that a bit more money or delay the repayments or something like that. I mean, that is really just touching the sides. So he'll announce it with fanfare, but it won't really help people that much.
Yeah, some nice comments coming in, actually. Nolene, I hope I pronounced that right, Nolene McGuinness. Let's hope he takes into account the 2 years of pandemic we've already experienced. Absolutely. Well, we'll see. And somebody named Room Rescue. The government needs to help the elderly and disabled. You've slightly touched on that, I think, especially, and low-income households having to choose between heating and eating and keeping warm shouldn't be eating between and keeping warm shouldn't be a choice in this country. 100% agree with that. So yeah, I mean that's going to be. I'm interested on this point about the benefits. So benefits are due to go up by how much?
3.1%.
3.1%.
Something like £10 a month on universal credit.
Right, okay.
Before you count in childcare and stuff like that.
Right. Bank of England now talking about cost of living 10%. So a huge gap there. So there's as I say, one of our comments has specifically mentioned about those on low incomes, those disabled, the elderly. Do you think he is going to, and I take your point about the sort of black mark, not wanting to set a mark of going forward perhaps, but do you think that he will increase any of those benefits, potentially targeted? Do you think so? Or do you think that's just a red line that he just cannot step over when it comes to the public finances?
Budget predictions are incredibly dangerous 6 days out.
We won't hold you to this. We won't hold you to this.
Whoever's tweeting quotes from Mirror Politics, hold off on this one. But my prediction would be that 3.1% rise in benefits and pensions is not going to change, because any change in that is billions of pounds. What you might get is a bit more tweaking around the edges if he were to be forced to announce something. So, for example, what I mentioned on slightly improving the sort of repayable £200 discount off energy bills that's coming on October, or as one Tory MP has suggested, bringing forward in time next year's rise in benefits. Because the problem with this is it kind of reflects the general flux of inflation. So what ministers are claiming is you can't change that 3.1% now, because it will feed through into what's happening now will feed through into next year's rise at some point. So people will benefit in the end. It's just that doesn't really help people now when they've got bills to pay and food to buy, does it? So one idea was to bring it forward to October and have kind of 2 rises in benefits in the same year. But one thing that, what we do know about what the Chancellor is thinking is he doesn't really want to announce anything else on energy bills, if he can help it, before the April the 1st rise. And obviously the spring statement comes before April the 1st, because there's going to be another rise in October by the looks of things. It could be a very, very big one. And so the thinking in the Treasury, as far as we can tell, is that if they have to announce something, they want to do it between April and October.
Right.
So is that going to be enough?
Yeah. Okay. There's a nice comment. It's certainly a comment, I think, more than a question, but I'll read it out. This is from Paul Dingle. I imagine it will be more of the same: protection of the 1% and their big piles of cash, and more pain for the working population. It's a Tory government. What else will it be? I'm not sure. I have no idea what voter, who party he votes for. But there you go. Yeah, certainly interesting comment. Thanks, Paul. And the other big question in run up to this statement is going to be on national insurance, and you've certainly alluded to that earlier on. Do you want to tell us what there's a lot of pressure for him to do, and what do you think? Putting your head on the line again, what do you think the chances of him doing anything about it? So yeah, if you can cover both those answers, thank you.
So national insurance is going up from 12% to 13.25%, which may sound pretty incremental, but that's, if you were to put income tax up by 1% on everyone, that would be a pretty big deal, and it's relatively similar to that out of your pay packet. What the pressure is on him to do from both sides, lots of Tories who just don't like tax rises and the high tax burden, and Labour who think it's the wrong tax at the wrong time, is to scrap that. The problem is the laws for it have already been passed, and it's £12 billion a year for the government, so they really do not want to scrap this. And Number 10 are continually telling us that it is not being scrapped. The Treasury are telling us it's full steam ahead. I think even the Tory MPs that we talk to who are against it are pretty well like, well, I'm not going to not push on it, but I appreciate that this is almost certainly not going to happen, and I'm hitting my head against the brick wall here. So that's both your questions, isn't it?
Yeah, and I know that certainly from businesses, because we look at the increase in the national insurance contributions for employees, but employers obviously are seeing their contributions go up as well. So there's sort of a lot of pressure from with workers. I just am reading a couple more comments. There's some fantastic comments coming in. Thank you. Julie Lane says, if there is no increase in benefits and pensions with all the cost of living increases, what makes the Tories think that they deserve a pay increase when they put in claims for expenses, which really means that their cost of living are next to nothing? I think there's maybe there's slightly touched on there. I'm not sure, Julie, if this is what you were alluding to as well. Was MPs' pay? Is that going to be? This is kind of, it's a separate issue, obviously, but it's obviously blown up a little bit recently. Do you think that's going to be a big issue in the next few months?
Well, I mean, yes, it's probably as much of an issue as it's going to be, because the pay rise has already been announced and stuff.
Right.
But this is the great irony. MPs' pay is going up by 2.7%. So actually, that's slightly less than they're offering to nurses in a percentage thing. But because MPs already earn 80 and a bit £1,000, that's obviously a lot more cash into their bank account. It's more than £2,000 as a pay rise, and I don't think vast majority of workers are going to see a £2,000 pay rise this year, even if they get 3, 4, 5%. But at the same time, I can bring you exclusively the news from Parliament that MPs are really struggling now because prices in the canteens have gone up, or are going up on April the 1st, I think by about the same amount. The first time but that's for the first time in 3 years. They haven't gone up since 2019.
Oh, okay.
So it's a bit sort of there is this feeling among people, and how much it's borne out, you can judge for yourself, of that MPs are basically cushioned from a lot of the pain that hits people because they have second homes in London, which are paid for by the taxpayer, because they have quite a high salary, because it is uprated in line with sort of average earnings and that sort of thing. And the food here there's arguments about exactly how subsidized or just cost price or whatever it is, but it's cheaper than going out to a Pret or whatever, or a Costa, and getting your sandwich. So a lot of that MPs would say, well, we have no control over that. Pay is set by an independent body. And they did that deliberately over the MPs' expenses scandal, so that they had no say over their own pay anymore. But the perception is still there, isn't it? And ultimately, if you earn a reasonably large sum of money, you are cushioned more against this stuff than someone who doesn't.
Do you know what I'm really interested in hearing from you is also, walking the corridors of power there in Parliament and hearing the sort of rumblings of what goes on. What about the tensions between Boris Johnson and if not least Rishi Sunak, Chancellor, and the Treasury? Can you sort of talk about the slightly opposing? They're not in step all the time, are they? So tell us about those pressures, particularly in this crucial last week for the spring statement.
Yeah, it's ironic because if you remember, the way that Rishi Sunak became Chancellor was over a big row about how Sajid Javid was the Chancellor, but basically got ousted because Number 10 wanted to exercise too much control over him. So when Rishi Sunak was brought in as a replacement, there was this feeling that he was going to be a sort of lackey, a dog's body for Boris Johnson's Number 10. He was this quite junior guy, and he was going to be pushed around. Actually, now that there's some leadership talk around him, he's kind of staked his claim with COVID. There's quite a lot of friction there, as there always is with a Chancellor and a Prime Minister. So the personality issues here are particularly sharp, that you've got Rishi Sunak, who's a more sort of traditional conservative who wants to cut spending and cut taxes. And he keeps telling Tory MPs he's going to cut taxes by the next election, but how much that's actually going to happen, God knows, because he's just raised taxes to one of the highest levels in decades. And you've got Boris Johnson, who is kind of all things, tries to be all things to all people, but fundamentally is quite an impulsive sort of chasing after big ticket announcements. Will announce a big load of spending here, and remember the Garden Bridge and the Island Airport that he tried to do as mayor. His instincts are towards, who cares about the cost? Let's just have this big shiny project. And that is a lot of the friction here, is that Boris Johnson, there was some talk, I think, even of Downing Street sort of pushing out big announcements without the Treasury having signed them off yet in years gone by. So that's the real tension here. And it's whether Boris Johnson takes that thinking to, well, actually, we have to help people who are in need, otherwise I'll be screwed at the next election, sort of thing, and pushes Rishi Sunak on that. That's the key question of whether that comes through.
And of course, sort of in the background, we've got the May local elections, haven't we? Which is that so much has changed, isn't it? So much changes so quickly. But what do you think the big factors is? What's going to be announced next Wednesday? Are they looking ahead to those local elections in terms of showing that they're listening to the electorate, particularly when it comes to the cost of living? Do you think that is in the back of their mind, in the forefront of their mind, not at all in their minds?
I think it's probably more in the MPs' minds than it is in the Treasury's mind, because this is sort of wild speculation a little bit, but based on talking to MPs and stuff. MPs are worried about the local elections a little bit. They want to make sure they've got something to offer people, but the Treasury's general view tends to be that we shouldn't be just dishing out kind of retail politics announcements and baubles, as some of the more cynical Tories might call it, / being able to pay your bills, as the Mirror might call it, to people for electoral gain. And indeed, we've had a pop at the government quite rightly before for when things are announced in a sort of pork barrel politics way, if certain constituencies get the money they need. So I guess we'll have to see, have an eye on things like if there's any levelling up funding to particular parts of the country, things like that. That has often been accused of having a sort of quid pro quo, we'll give you this money and you can benefit because you can benefit the next election and trumpet the next election in a marginal seat. But generally, I think the Treasury wants to take this approach, or claims it wants to take this approach, where it's sort of building back over years into the future and being more fiscally responsible and not spending £400 billion responding to a pandemic and the sort of various fraud issues that came along with the business loans in that. So there's a real tension there.
I know that we talk about inflation and the impact on households quite rightly, but there's an impact on inflation when it comes to the government finances, isn't there? In terms of the cost of borrowing, I think they're if you think your credit card bill was pretty big last month, I think the national debt is something like 2 trillion. So and whenever interest rates go up, when inflation goes up, it pushes up the bill on their interest on those. So but the government borrowing has come on is lower than predicted this year. Does that nevertheless give the Treasury more wriggle room in terms of announcing anything, or do you think it's they're not going to necessarily use that? There's no war chest there, I suppose, is there?
Well, no, because even though borrowing has fallen, the cost of servicing that borrowing, paying back the debt, will go up because of inflation. So actually, it kind of, I think 6 months ago or so, there was talk of him having more headroom than he'd expected, and now the feeling, nothing's confirmed, but the feeling seems to be that actually that headroom might have disappeared because of the and you can't spend money on much as the Treasury unless you borrow more because of all those debt repayments.
I know I've got a question for you, which again, unless you have brilliant insights into what the Treasury is thinking right at this moment, you might not be able to answer, or maybe you will, because one is on fuel duty. Anyone who's been to the forecourt recently will be wincing at the how much it costs them to fill up, even if they could afford to fill up. Do you think there will be is there any hope of a cut in fuel duty?
No. Okay. So fuel duty was set this year already in the budget, and they froze it. So they've done that for 12 years. There's all sorts of arguments about whether that's the right thing, but it's at least stopped a crazy spiral in prices. Well, it hasn't stopped it, has it? So it's stopped things being higher than they were, I should say. But in terms of cutting fuel duty, this is something that some Tory MPs are calling for. I think some Tory MPs had said that it should be cut for specific industries, maybe, to sort of haulage and things like that, to just keep the cost down for industry. But first of all, after freezing it for so long, I think there might be a bit of a feeling that they've been generous enough, whether or not that's actually filtering through to the pumps. But more importantly, what I've been told the thinking is that actually if you cut fuel duty by a few p in a way that deprives the Treasury of billions of pounds, actually you don't feel it that much on filling up on a tank of petrol on a family car. Because fuel costs are so high already. I think we're looking at £1.60, like £1.70 at the pumps almost now, aren't we? I don't have a car these days because I live in London. I used to. But that is a huge cost when you fill up your tank. And actually, even if you were to have, £5 off a £50-60 tank of petrol, I mean, your feeling isn't going to be, hooray, I've got 10% off or whatever. Your feeling would be, bloody hell, that's an expensive tank of petrol. So maybe the cost benefit situation isn't there for them, or they don't think it is.
Okay. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. Some really great comments coming in. They're comments rather than questions, so that's why I'm kind of not putting too many to you. But yeah, okay. So just to sort of recap, then. So, well, firstly, none of us really knows. We might know potentially at the weekend. Sometimes there's always or maybe in the days running up to it. The Treasury can be a bit leaky, or will it not be this time?
Well, actually, Rishi Sunak got massively told off by the Commons Speaker last time for dripping things out in the days before. We get this flurry of press releases. I've been told that there will be less of that this time. I will believe it when I see it, because inevitably, even if there aren't official announcements, sometimes some well-informed journalists come up with stories, and we don't know where they've got them from, but they seem to be very well sourced, and then they turn out to be correct. So, yeah, whether it's a leak or a press release, things seem to find a way out. But we should probably see Rishi Sunak out and about this weekend, because he usually does like a big interview on the Sunday before, usually with the BBC on the Sunday morning, and it'll be a question of how much he gives away. There, he might just say broad brush, or he might try and pre-announce something. We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, so essentially, so while we don't know what's going to come, what's coming up, what would be a big surprise to you, by the sounds of things, is if there was any announcement on benefits, any sort of any across the board increase in benefits, certainly to anything anything to try and bridge the gap between the 3.1% and what inflation is expected to be. That sounds like unlikely. That would be a big surprise. Ditto on the national insurance. That's pretty much baked in, you think? Yeah. So, and certainly not on fuel duty. Okay, not on fuel duty either as well. That doesn't seem likely. So, so really, there's we're going to be a surprise, or could it be a bit of a damp squib? I mean, sometimes these things are. Sometimes we're also like get up and stands up at 12:30 and the minutes tick away, and there's lots of boasts about how well the government's doing. But do you think this necessarily there won't necessarily be a huge amount in terms of big announcements? Will it be recapping what they've already announced?
Yeah, I'm not a betting man, but if I was, my money would be on damp squib. But of course, if it's a damp squib, it's also a big story, because that means he's announcing that there's a massive cost of living and inflation crisis, and he's not dealing with it. So.
Okay, fine, fantastic. And as for rabbit out the hat, practically we don't even know what a rabbit out the hat is, apart from in a literal sense. This is where they announce that they generally leave the surprise announcement normally right towards the sort of the tail end of the announcement. Yeah. And then,
so that the journalists have no time to write it up before rushing into reading the documents and briefings and things. It serves their advantage. But last time it was that he was improving the rate of universal credit for people who work, and basically tapering away their benefits less for every pound they earn by something like 8p in the pound. But the irony with that, of course, was it came after a £20 cut for everyone and didn't make it up. So it kind of proves the point I'm making, that the overall rate of benefits, pensions, pay, and stuff is just falling behind inflation. But there might be some tweaks to try and grab some headlines and try and target some.
And you finish on a very good point.
Target.
Yeah, you finish on a very good point, because this is where you don't believe everything. When you hear the spring statement, it'll all sound fairly rosy as much as possible. The devil is always in that detail, isn't it? And what might sound like a big benefit, a plus, once you start unpicking it, you realise that it isn't quite as generous as it might have might sounded. So, okay, well, listen, thank you, Dan. That's been really helpful. Everyone, thank you very much for your comments coming in, and it's been really fantastic to hear what people have got to say as well. But for now, and good luck with next Wednesday. It'll be a very busy day for you. So I look forward to seeing what happens on the day. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Cheers.